Well, Dr. Scheller, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Arlena. I'm so excited to be here and I'm excited for
Yeah,
our discussion.
me too. Oh my gosh, we were just chit-chatting about writing this amazing book. So those of you who are you have it too. Of course you do. So those of you who are listening on the podcast, I highly recommend you go to the YouTube channel because we're holding up the book. It's amazing. The title is How to Eat to Change How You Drink, Heal Your Gut, Mend Your Mind, and Improve Nutrition to Change Your Relationship with Alcohol. Amazing. Congratulations on completing this amazing book.
Thank you so much. It's been a true test of strength and will to get through it, but
That's
I really
hard.
think it came from somewhere else. I don't think it came from me. I think it came from a higher power, and that's all I'll say about that.
That's a lot. I mean, I want to know more about that. I mean, there's this idea of sort of like being open and
Mhm.
letting the muse or whatever you want to call it, the genius, sort of like we're the vessel or the channel for this information to come through. And as it comes through, it heals us. Did you have that experience?
I did. Well, the interesting part about this is, I'm a doctor of nutrition by trade. I've been in practice, or I've been in the field for over 10 years. And, when I was a drinker, when I was a heavy drinker, I was kind of always on that mission to prove that you could drink alcohol and be healthy, as I think a lot of people, most people are,
A
right?
fool's errand, I dare say.
Yes. And I really tried. I really tried to put that
Yeah.
to the test. And I came to my own breaking point and quit drinking in June of 2021. And ironically, before I quit drinking, I actually had been asked to author a textbook chapter on nutrition and supplementation for substance use disorders in a textbook on integrative approaches to substance use disorders. And so I wrote this textbook chapter kind of within the last year of my drinking. So I'm drinking heavily and I'm writing this textbook chapter. And, I've always been, yeah, I know the
Oh, the
giggling.
irony.
Oh, the irony, right? But I've always been interested in this topic because I have a family history of addiction and mental health disorders. And I was intrigued when I was asked to write this book or this chapter in this book, and I did. And the month that that book published, ironically, is the same month that I got sober in June of
Mm.
2021. And I don't think it was the book publishing that inspired my sobriety. I think it was more of an irony. However, within a few months of getting sober, now having done the research and learned more about that topic for that textbook, when I did get sober, I was implementing certain supplements. I was utilizing these different tools that I had written about to support my journey. I remember specifically one particular day where I was really struggling with an alcohol craving, and I took a supplement that I speak about a lot in the book called L-glutamine, which can help with sugar cravings, with alcohol cravings. It's part of my Craving Crusher supplements, one of my the supplements in my line. And that really helped me get through that day. Now, whether that was placebo or not is, we'll leave that to the gods to understand or to know the answer. But, a few months into my sobriety, I think I was 3 months or so sober, and I had this hit of inspiration and like came through me like a lightning bolt where I was like, I have to write a book on this. And it was maybe 9:30 or 10 p.m. on a weekday night, and I grabbed my laptop and I'm Googling how to find a book agent in New York City. I'm Googling, it says, okay, find out you got to write a query letter. So I'm Googling how to write a query letter. So at 10 p.m. on, whatever random night of the week it was, I had found two women that I wrote this query letter to and ended up pitching them this idea for this book. Well, one of them kind of passed me off and said, oh, let me know when you have a proposal. I'll be interested to see. And the other one, sure enough, without knowing, is an agent who represented another really well-known and successful book in the quit lit space.
Can
And
you say
she
who?
signed me. I I'm not sure if I can or not, so I'm going to just not say.
Damn it. Now I want to know what other book.
Yeah, and I had no idea, like this wasn't public on her website or anything, so I didn't know this. And I ended up signing an agent, I ended up getting a book deal, and then I ended up writing the book, which is in your hands and mine,
I know, so
and will
great.
be in everyone's hands starting December 26th of 2023. So it's been really a labor of love, as we were just chatting about before we hopped on the call.
Yeah.
A lot of work and a lot of you know, late nights and 8 p.m. cups of coffee and you know, deadlines and timelines and edits, and but it's been one of the most fulfilling things that I've ever done, and I'm just so excited and thrilled to bring some of this information more mainstream and hopefully help people integrate nutrition as part of their sober curious, or even just, you know, if they're looking to cut back and need some support on that.
Yeah, I think this is a great place to meet people. You know, everybody sort of has like this beginning place. And I think this is a great place to begin. There were those of us who were like hardcore alcoholic, I would say. You know, I've been sober for a long time. And when I got sober, there was nothing. There was the big book and virtually nothing else. And so now there's a lot of different options and a lot of conversation around the alcohol-free lifestyle, which sort of is, you know, just distracts, detracts, or just, it's just sort of another place to start when we talk about quitting drinking. And I love the introduction of your book, how you talked about how we got here. You know, you talked about that voice that kept getting louder and louder and louder. How did you come to the conclusion that you needed to start practicing abstinence?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, as I share it in the introduction of the book, I talk about how it starts as a whisper, right? It kind of starts as this like little voice in the back of your head that's like, maybe I should quit drinking. Like maybe something's off with this. Maybe I'm going down a bad path with this. And as you mentioned, it kind of gets louder and louder. And we say this about a lot of things in life, right? That the universe, God, higher power, whatever you believe in, that like it's going to come in and it's going to whisper, and then it's going to, you know, tap you on the shoulder, and then it's going to, you know, crash into you, because if you don't listen to that path, if you don't listen to that calling, if you don't listen to that inner voice, that inner knowing, things are going to happen that will make it more obvious that it's time to change, right? So as you learned in my story, I started drinking heavily as a teenager and continued that on through my 20s and into my early 30s. And, you know, I think I knew for at least 10 years that I had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, but I didn't know that there was any other way, really. You know, I was raised on you get drunk and that's how you deal with your stuff, and that's how you socialize with people, and you know, that's how you make friends, and that's how you get along with coworkers, and you know, working in restaurants and bars, right? That all instilled that nature in me as well. And in the last 5 years or so, that voice had gotten a lot louder, right? Like it had gotten pretty loud to the point where I was still functioning. I was high functioning in the sense that I was able to get graduate degrees, and I was able to, you know, get good jobs and keep, you know, steady income and all of those types of things. But you know, most of my life outside of that was suffering. You know, I had very dysfunctional relationships. I had a lot of anxiety and depression that I was dealing with, and health things that were starting to sneak up as well. And I was just pushing that all down, because even though that voice comes through and it starts to get louder, well, what's the one thing that quiets that voice? Is drinking more alcohol, right?
Yes.
And so you want to like stop hearing that, and so you pour a little bit more alcohol on it, right? And unfortunately, that's why so many of us have to hit that rock bottom moment before we make a change, because things aren't bad enough, right? Like we haven't gotten to the point where maybe we've lost friends, or we've lost relationships, or we've lost jobs, or we've gotten a DUI, for example. of course, when we get to that point, it's much more glaring. But I think what's really beautiful about the era that we're in of sober curious and people just exploring more about what sobriety can look like for them is that they don't necessarily have to get to that point where they've lost things, they've had these kind of life-changing events. And for me, I didn't have any one particular moment that was this this horrible thing that happened to me, thank God, but what I did experience was the culmination of a lot of different things, a lot of different areas in my life that were suffering. And as I share in my book, in my story, all it took at the end was one person to bring it up to me and say, I see that this is happening. And they didn't approach me in a way that was uncomfortable. They didn't say, hey, you have a problem, you need help. They just simply said, like, I kind of noticed that this is going on. And at that time, I felt this like overwhelming sense of relief that I think something has to change.
Yeah.
And so it's again, and it's interesting, right? Because we were talking a little bit about 12-step work, and, there's in some of the 12-step literature, there's this talk about, a spiritual experience isn't necessarily this white light, aha, God, lightning bolt strikes down, and it's these little things, right? These little moments in life that if we just listen and we pick up on that, there's really interesting and beautiful, beautiful things that come from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that I got was that the pain was worse than, like, the pain of not changing was worse than the pain of continuing the way you are. And I think that I kind of want to touch on that a little bit, because I was like you in the sense, like, I didn't get fired from a job. I never got a DUI. Like, I didn't, I didn't crash like nothing. I had nothing, but I was suffering. I got to that really dark place where it was like, I can't go on this way, but I cannot imagine my life without alcohol. And I sought the solutions that were available to me at the time, which were 12. Yeah, I had people in my life that were like, just come see. And I was like, okay. And I had a beautiful experience, and it's been 29 years, but I kind of am just curious, what was the pain where you were like, I can't do this anymore? What was the this, if that makes sense?
Yeah, the pain for me was, I was in a lot of emotional pain. I'm someone who's been, and I just made a post about this on Instagram the other day. Ever since I was a young child, I've been hyper emotional. I've always felt really big feelings. I've always felt all of my feelings really intensely. And I've always quieted that with alcohol, because I was never taught a way to cope with that.
Right.
And that helps for a little while, right? Like, so for those of us who experience that, or are people who feel feelings really, really big or really deeply.
Yeah, that was me
alcohol,
for sure.
Alcohol does, it is effective in dulling the edges of those and making them a little bit softer, but it doesn't work forever, right? Because the more we use it, the more we are feeling the effects of it, right? And it's almost taking those, I have these big feelings, and turning them up instead of turning them down, right? So it might quiet them down 50%, but now it's turning them up 110%, right? And what's really interesting for me, and something where I feel really passionately to speak to, is like, this is where the biochemical stuff is really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because, when we start to think about how alcohol affects our biology, it affects our internal processes in our body, how it depletes out our nutrients, how those affect our neurotransmitters, and how our brain creates serotonin and dopamine, those feel-good hormones. There's also even simple nutrient deficiencies that are associated with crying easily, right? Something like vitamin B6, that if you have a deficiency in this, you could be someone who is more apt to cry more easily, right? It has to do with our neurological system and our brain and these important nutrients that we need. And so, when we look at it, and we could dive as deep as you want into the science, but when we think about how alcohol is really affecting our biology internally, it makes a lot of sense why we experience these outcomes when we drink too much, right? That again, it gives us this kind of dulling effect, but then turns things up a little bit, because it kind of leaves us in a worse place than we came in on, right? And it doesn't just do that on a short-term basis, in the sense that we have a hangover and we feel it the next day, or maybe a second day later. These are effects that happen and compound over time. And so if we don't short circuit that and kind of get in there and fix that, yeah, we feel worse and worse and worse over time, not just physically, but also mentally and emotionally.
Yeah, I really appreciate the science and mechanics behind it, because then it becomes impersonal. Then it's not like, oh, I'm not a defective human being. I'm a organism that has different mechanisms that are affected by what I ingest, whether it's nutrition or alcohol or drugs or whatever. So that felt like it made it a little impersonal, so that I was like, okay, I'm not a horrible person. And that was more apt to receive more solutions. So we kind of talked about, your family. So, in answering the question to drink or not to drink. And I like the way you go through you have a section in your book that helps people answer that question. So I'm going to say buy the book just for that. Also the quiz. We're going to have to talk about the quiz. Who doesn't love a quiz? Okay. So the quiz is amazing. And you also have some exercises. I want to get to those too. But, I love how the book is framed without using triggering language like alcoholic or sober. So I feel like it was so like gentle and compassionate. And we're talking about what's really important. We're not assigning moral meanings to anything. It's a very I want to say ingestible. That's probably not the right word considering what we're talking about, but you know what I'm saying? It's just easier to consume this information when it's under this guise of a compassionate framework. But there's a couple of questions that you brought up that I thought was really good. I think there's a common misconception that we see all the time in the mainstream media about, oh, a little red wine is good for you, or is a little bit of alcohol good for you? I know it's not for me, like it's poison on any level, but what do you think?
Yeah, and that's been, I played around with how to frame this in the book, because I think it's such an important topic. And obviously, when we're talking about health in addition to alcohol, there's this misconception, and rightfully so. I mean, the media put this in our faces in the early 2000s in a way that we really do, as a society, believe that red wine or small amounts of alcohol are potentially good for us. And a lot of that comes from early research on the Mediterranean diet and, the countries surrounding the Mediterranean, like Italy and France, Greece, for example, some of these countries that have really low incidence of cardiovascular disease rates. And they also consume low to moderate amounts of alcohol, specifically wine. And it's really interesting. And I've had this come up even more recently, because there's kind of a resurgence in the conversation around blue zones.
Oh yeah,
and yeah. And so I just had someone commenting on a post yesterday that, well, what about the blue zones? And there's a lot of things in the blue zones, right, that allow these people to be healthier, right? And we kind of just like hyper focus on, well, they're drinking wine, right? They're also eating like high amounts of vegetables and fresh produce. They're not eating high amounts of processed foods and sugars. So there's a lot of things and complexities in there. And that's part of what spawned that early conversation around the reduced risk for cardiovascular disease and some of these other health concerns. So, there's controversy over that. In fact, in 2022, a few really interesting landmark studies had come out, one of which that refuted that there was benefit at low levels for cardiovascular disease. And they basically, very large study came out to say that actually, we don't think that it is positive. In fact, we think any amount is probably having a negative impact. So while there's controversy around things like heart health, there's no controversy around things like brain health, right? Because we see in the research, it's pretty clear that alcohol has a negative effect on the brain. And then when we look at things that I talk a lot about in the book, like nutrient deficiencies and things like the gut microbiome and our hormone levels, our stress hormone levels like cortisol, all of the evidence actually shows that alcohol is very negative towards those things, right? And so this is where we have to be our own scientists a little bit and learn to decipher what's just media hype and what's kind of overpopularization, for sales and for big alcohol and big marketing companies, big food companies, right? What's interesting too is I was looking at the Blue Zone site the other day because this conversation again has come up a lot lately. And if you go on the Blue Zone page about red wine, it actually towards the bottom links you to a page where you can buy the wine that they are talking about is good for you, right? So it's a sales tactic, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
this is again how we have to be just a little bit more mindful of what the research does show is that even if you don't drink alcohol now, if there are some potential benefits of it at low amounts, there's actually more benefit to not drinking it at all.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of confusing thing that happens in the research that says like, well, if you have maybe 1 glass or 1/2 a glass of wine, that maybe there are some potential benefits to that. But the problem, and what we talk about in the book, is like, who is actually having that 1 glass of wine or that 1/2 a glass of wine and stopping there, right? Because anything over a very minimal amount there is no controversy, right? It is negative for your health.
Yeah. I just think it's hilarious. Andrew Huberman did that on Huberman Labs, an episode about alcohol, and it was the most downloaded episode of the entire year. One thing I didn't know is that alcohol is fat soluble and water soluble. So it literally permeates every cell of your body. And I mean, it was just such an interesting episode. But, so for people that are listening to this that are like, okay, I know I should quit drinking, people that are early days, how do you think about reducing cravings? Like, what are your approaches to helping people reduce cravings?
Yeah, so that's a big portion of the book is focused on how to utilize nutrition to support the early part of that journey. I kind of look at it in 2 ways. Nutrition has benefits across the board for anyone, whether you've quit yet or not, if you've recently quit, if you quit 2 years ago or 20 years ago, right? There are nutrition principles that can benefit everyone, especially if there's been pretty heavy history of alcohol use intake. The first few years, your body is still recovering. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of replenishing our nutrients, healing our gut, healing our hormones, et cetera. But especially in the short term, nutrition is a really, in my opinion, underrated approach to eliminating cravings. And a lot of it has to do with our blood sugar. And now, so many people know that when we quit drinking alcohol, we have this major increase in sugar cravings, right?
Yeah.
And we often think, and there is an association with dopamine, and that's where a lot of people think the big connection is to, well, we need this dopamine hit, and that's why we switch the alcohol craving for the sugar craving. And actually, it has a lot to do also with our blood sugar. And this is because alcohol, especially when we consume it on a frequent or regular basis, alcohol does cause long-term changes to our body's ability to manage blood sugar regularly. There are some books that were written about this many years ago, and there's actually a statistic that about 95% of people with a history of alcohol use have blood sugar imbalances or a tendency toward hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar. And you probably know this from if you've gone a long period of time without eating, that when we are hungry, when we haven't eaten for a long period of time, we go into a drop in blood sugar and we crave sugar and carbohydrates to give us a boost back up. And so what's happening in our body when we take out the alcohol is we will start to have these drops in our blood sugar that will manifest as these sugars, not only for, these cravings for sugar, carbs, but also for alcohol, right? And so one of the big things that we can do is utilize principles of just simple blood sugar management. So we talk in the book about things like incorporating more protein in and making sure you have a good source of protein at every meal. Also making sure you're having your meals every 3 to 4 hours, not going long periods of time without skipping, because when we get into that low blood sugar situation, we don't have as much control or willpower, right? And people are always saying, well, I don't have the willpower to quit, or I don't have the willpower to say no to this sweet or treat. And oftentimes it's not you actually at all. It's your body, right? It's your body sending you signals that we need food because our blood sugar is low. And if we don't have food, we're going to have a problem, right? And so, those simple principles of eating more frequently, eating more protein, I've seen it now in my work with hundreds of clients in what I call functional sobriety, which is my approach, my program. Yeah. And that is really one of the easiest, simplest things that if you're listening that you can do is increase your protein, try to aim for 25 grams or so per meal, and then making sure that you're not going long periods of time without having something to eat.
Yeah. In 12-step rooms, they call that hungry, angry, lonely, tired, halt. It's like when you start feeling all the things, then it's time to take care of your body.
Yeah. And again, that's the thing is like, and I don't think when AA was, created, he was thinking about, they knew anything about the science behind that, right? But what was happening is when we're hungry, we have low blood sugar, and that low blood sugar is going to make it really, really difficult for us to say no to something that's going to boost blood sugar back up.
This question keeps coming to mind. Is there a lot of sugar in alcohol?
So the tricky thing is yes, alcohol can break down, or what we think alcohol does is breaks down to sugar in the body. Alcohol itself doesn't necessarily have a lot of sugar. Sometimes when we're consuming alcohol, it brings in a lot of sugar with it. If we're having
we mix it with a
cranberry
lot of sugar.
Juice or right? But what's actually happening in the biochemistry is your body breaks down alcohol, and the ethanol itself has an impact on how our liver releases our hormones that actually manage blood sugar. So even if you were to drink something that was very low in carbohydrates or very low in sugar, so people drink vodka club, right? I call this the vodka club theory. People drink vodka club thinking that, well, there's no sugar, there's no carbs, it's good for me. However, it's still causing effects to your blood sugar because it is affecting how your body releases these hormones that manage your blood sugar.
Okay. So it basically has the same effect as like a sugar addiction would.
It does, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And sugar is so hard to get off of. I mean, it's like once you get rid of the drugs and alcohol, then it's like the carbs and the sugar we got to get off of.
Well, and that's why utilizing these principles are going to help for sugar cravings too. And they're going to help with that process, because it's really about, we're transferring the addiction. Again, if we try not to think of it so much from an addiction, like the sugar addiction being like very difficult to change, that we can actually manipulate that a lot by what we're eating. So again, if we're eating more protein, if we're eating more regularly, if we're not allowing ourselves to even have sugar alone, right? One of the things that we talk about in the book too is trying to stack sugar or sweets on top of a meal. So not having it alone, because that's going to affect how our body reacts to that sugar. It's going to affect our potential sugar cravings later in the day or even the next day, because again, of that blood sugar management perspective. So we oftentimes transfer that into sugar, into carbohydrates. But again, it's because of blood sugar, right? So if we can manage that blood sugar, then we can have a really big change on that outcome.
No, that's really helpful to know. I want to ask you a little bit about the 3 archetypes. You have a quiz. I love a quiz. Everybody loves a quiz. You have these 3 archetypes, so social, stress, and habitual. And in my practice, I've seen all 3, right? And I love how you like break it down. And there's a quiz. What was the intent of the quiz and identifying sort of what kind of drinker you are?
Yeah. So, I think that I wanted to ensure that when writing the book that it was speaking to multiple audiences. And, while I myself, in the end of my drinking, most identified with a habitual drinker or someone who was drinking most days of the week, several drinks per day. I also, when I started working with people in sobriety and nutrition, and when I first created the functional sobriety approach, I had a lot of people that were coming to me who were in this social drinker category. And they were people who were not going to go to an AA room, for example, or not going to go to the extremes of trying to quit alcohol through maybe, again, the way that someone who's drinking more every single day would. But they were coming to me and saying, I don't think I need to completely quit drinking because I don't have a problem. I'm not drinking every single day. But when I go out and I go out with certain friends, or I go out, on the weekends to a party, once I start, I can't stop, and I need help with that. Right. So I was noticing that there are these different archetype patterns that were happening, and that the way to speak to someone who is a daily drinker is very different than the way to speak to someone who is a once a week drinker, but, binge drinker. And when it came down to it, again, for me, a lot of this was based out of the science, right? So the reason why the social drinker drinks is very different than this habitual drinker and how they drink.
Right.
And then similarly with the stress drinker who, obviously drinks mostly out of stress, that there's these, again, biochemical things that are happening. A stress drinker is drinking because they are experiencing high levels of stress. Alcohol is kind of helping them come back down from it. How do we look at that from a perspective of using food and wellness practices to support that person might be a little bit different than the social drinker, right?
Let me just interrupt you real quick. Because I know many stress drinkers, high pressure jobs, for whatever reason, I get a lot of doctors and lawyers, and they are high functioning, but under a tremendous amount of stress. And even though they're drinking responsibly, it's like the effects, they're still getting all the negative effects. So how does somebody with a high stress trigger, like how does nutrition factor in? Is it the you're building up all the nutrition that was depleted over time, and then having like in the moment solutions like adding the protein? Is that kind of how to think about it?
Yeah. So, there's different things to think about with each archetype, and how each archetype is supported. And in the book, it does give you some suggestions per each archetype, if there's different foods that support that archetype, if there's different kind of recommendations that are specifically
give me the recommendations for the stress guy.
indicated.
Stress one.
So, there's a few things to think about with the stress drinker. One of them is cortisol, and cortisol being our body's main stress hormone, which is produced anytime we are in a state of stress. And this topic is really important, and it's not just specific to, to drinking even, but we experience high levels of stress, everything from our work environment to health situations that might be happening to our family, our relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And, one of the biggest things that I had seen with someone who was a stress drinker who kind of inspired that archetype for me was she was someone who worked a very high stress job. She would come home at the end of the day at 5 o'clock. She would open up a bottle of wine. And when we dug into that a little bit, she had shared with me that she's actually uses alcohol at the end of the day to give her a little bit of energy or motivation to get through the rest of her day, right? So she said that she can open up the bottle of wine. She felt that she experienced this kind of second wind of motivation to do the laundry and make dinner and do these other things. And, you know, what was actually happening with her, and what happens with a lot of stress drinkers is, again, this is where blood sugar, again, I could circle back to this topic a lot, because stress also plays a really close role with our blood sugar. And the reason why is because anytime we go into a high state of stress, our body needs sugar to actually fuel itself, right? To get through these kind of high stress periods, right? So our cortisol is actually very closely linked with our blood sugar. And so one thing we did with this particular stress drinker is, you know, she had, when we looked into it, she hadn't had anything to eat since lunch. She, you know, didn't have necessarily a very healthy breakfast. And so when we actually looked at it, she was hungry, right? So she was coming home off of this long day. She was super stressed. Her stress levels had kind of bottomed out her blood sugar. And what we did, and what I recommend for everyone, stress drinker or not, is always having an afternoon snack between 3 and 5 p.m. So what we always call the witching hour, right? Well, a lot of people have trouble getting through that period of time because they're actually in a low blood sugar state, right?
So they need a protein snack, a high protein snack.
They need a high protein snack. Yep, high protein snack, some fiber in there. So something like an apple and peanut butter. My biggest recommendation for people, because I think it's really fun, is a cheese plate, and kind of setting it up with all the accoutrements and your fruit and your nuts, and making it something kind of fun and exciting, especially for a Friday.
At the end of the day.
Yeah.
Charcuterie board, yes.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting to see the biology behind it, right? Because we don't necessarily always think that that craving for a drink is, you know, we don't stop to think like, oh, well, am I really hungry? Now, again, in sobriety, we learn things like HALT, like, you know, you don't want to get into that period of hunger, anger, lonely, or tiredness, right? All those states all of them are a state of stress, right? And so when we can think about nutrition or eating as ways to combat stress, we can combat all of those things. It's just all about eating the right foods, right? And choosing things that are going to set us up for success, rather than send us into more cravings or into more stress.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Let's switch gears a little bit. I wonder what your thoughts are. You know, I'm older, menopausal, and hormones are a big topic for women in my age group. And although I haven't had a drink in a long time, I would imagine that if you're in your 40s or 50s and you're just starting to get to that place you want to live alcohol free, how does alcohol affect hormones like your estrogen, testosterone, stuff like your sexual health is a big issue? How do you think of healing from that perspective?
Yeah, so it's a really important topic when it comes to, alcohol elimination. In fact, the majority of the women that I work with are in the either perimenopausal or postmenopausal timeframe. And part of that is, we are getting to that point where we don't necessarily have as much tolerance to things like stress. We don't have, our metabolism is maybe changing. We are experiencing maybe more anxiety and depression. We're kind of hitting that wall, if you will.
I'll just say that at a certain age, you're just over it. You're like, I don't have time for this. I don't have time for bullshit in my life anymore.
Totally.
Over it. Yeah.
Yeah. And we don't always think of alcohol having such a direct impact on our hormones. We think of it affecting things like the liver. And, I think we know that it affects things like our mental health, but we don't necessarily look at alcohol and hormones. They kind of feel a little bit disconnected. They're actually very closely linked. And in fact, part of the reason why alcohol increases breast cancer risk is because of the impact it has on hormones. And there's a few reasons why this happens. One that I can share with you, easy to think about, is we know that alcohol affects the liver, right? Well, the liver is actually the main site of our hormone metabolism. So when we are drinking alcohol on a regular basis, we are putting priority we're putting like the number one tag thing to do in the body is eliminate alcohol. We are putting a pause and putting everything else in the back seat, including hormone metabolism, hormone waste removal from the body. And so alcohol has a really big impact on how we metabolize and excrete excess estrogen from the body. So that's part of why alcohol, the mechanism behind why alcohol increases breast cancer risk, because it causes us to hold on to that excess estrogen and not necessarily be metabolized as easily. It also, because of stress, and I'll go back to the stress topic because we'll keep going back there. Stress actually has a huge impact on our sex hormone production. So whether that is stress, external stress, so whether that is work stress, family stress, as we talked about, all of these other types of stress, but also, and like we were kind of talking about Andrew Huberman, one of the things he talks about in that alcohol podcast is he talks about how alcohol increases cortisol. Cortisol, again, is that stress hormone. So that is also going to throw off our hormones. So there's a lot of ways that this is throwing off our hormones. And we don't necessarily, we oftentimes attribute these changes that we experience to age, or we attribute it to, I'm hitting that menopausal era. And I speak to the women in my groups oftentimes a lot about how we don't necessarily have to experience hormonal symptoms, whether that's PMS, whether that is menopause symptoms, hot flashes, that a lot of that is actually manageable through food, dietary recommendations, supplement recommendations, but removing alcohol from the picture is going to play a really important role in balancing hormones.
I have several friends who suffer from what they call, my girlfriend calls it her period crazies. And I'm always like, and I was so excited to talk to you about this because I was like, listen, alcohol or not, like the women that are listening to this are going to be like, there's going to be so many that are like, how do I handle the period crazers? Are there supplements? Like I wanted to ask you about, I want to get to the brain neurotransmitters and specifically GABA and glutamate and whatever. But you tell me, like if somebody that is suffering from those period crazies, what can they take that will help kind of smooth that out? Is that a nutrition deficiency?
It could be. Sometimes it's a nutrient deficiency. A lot of different nutrients are important for normal hormone production, for normal, again, hormone management, waste removal. It's complex, right? So there's parts of it that go into our digestion, how our digestive system is functioning. I would say if you, not to shamelessly self-promote, but to shamelessly self-promote the book.
That's why you
a lot
here.
of this gets in depth in the book, right? Of how these kind of complexes all work together, the complexities of these things. It's multifaceted. And the one thing that I'll say is everybody's body is a little bit different, right? And so what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. But again, managing things like our cortisol, our stress hormones, that's going to help balance hormones. Managing digestion and supporting liver, which we can do through foods, we can do through supplements. That's also going to help with hormone balance. And
sorry to interrupt you, but what are foods or supplements that support liver function?
Yeah. So, there are many different supplements that do. I'll first start by just mentioning a few of my favorite liver support foods. One of them is beets, and there's many recipes on beets in the book, because I know they're tricky for some people. Some people don't love them. Yeah, there's some ways to implement them in ways that are easier to tolerate. There's a beet smoothie recipe, which is one of my like signature things. Beet chocolate cherry smoothie. And cruciferous vegetables are another category of veggies. So things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale. Those veggies are also really good at upregulating the liver waste removal pathways or detox pathways, so that we can get rid of those excess hormones, we can get rid of other toxins and waste in the system.
So that sort of begs the question, so it's so funny because nobody wants to hear the answer, which is you need to eat well. But there are supplements, I believe, that we can take. And, I go round and round with people about, who to get them from, like
Mhm.
what is a good source. So this is your whole world. Is there
Mhm.
a company that you specifically like to get supplements from?
Yeah. So what I recommend to people is you always want to get supplements through a company that has third-party testing.
Third party
So
testing.
there's a lot of different companies that are third-party tested. Typically, there are supplements that you can get privately through practitioners. So there are ways that you can work through a practitioner to get these supplements. But I always suggest, so I use a dispensary called Full Script, which anyone who works with me or who comes to my website and is interested in my protocols and things can access those supplements through there. I recently launched a supplement line that is exclusively for sober and sober curious. So they're
Nice.
customized packs that are for people different levels of sobriety. We also have a cravings crusher pack, which is great for if you're having a lot of sugar or alcohol cravings. But you always want to work with a company that is third party tested.
Okay.
And the reason why is because the supplement industry is not regulated.
Correct.
That's
Yeah.
why you often see things on labels like not regulated by
It's
the
not
FDA
FDA
or any of those
approved,
things.
blah, blah, blah.
Right. So that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that that product itself is a bad product. That's a legal disclaimer that has to be on any supplement because no supplements are regulated by the FDA. Only drugs are, only medications are.
Yeah. And I think what's
So it
crazy
makes
is
things a little tricky.
it does, because there's a lot of discussion about, sometimes when supplements are tested, the amounts are either absent or so minuscule they don't have a scientifically proved benefit. Like the amounts are too small. And so it sounds like you can help us take the guesswork out of it. You'll have to send me the links for what you recommend, your cravings crusher. Like, who doesn't want that?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
honestly, it's key. It's
Yeah.
key.
Okay.
It really
So you'll
helps a
send
lot
me
of
links.
people.
I'll
Yep.
include it in the show notes so that people don't have to hunt around for it.
Yep. Yep.
That
And
would be
that's where, like
amazing.
you're mentioning, the third party testing, they're doing that external testing so
I'm
that
sure. Yeah.
they're verifying that the amounts that are in there are accurate.
Okay. Yeah. So we only have 9 minutes left. So I think that people should just read the book for the neurotransmitter part. There's a lot of really good information in the book about how to support your neurotransmitter health. So ultimately, all of this is, in my mind, to affect two things: behavior change, and so that we can feel better. Right. If you boil it all
100%.
down, that's the outcome of this book. I feel like you did a really good job with this. And I want to talk a little bit about your signature program, the functional sobriety, because I know there's going to be people listening to this and be like, okay, but I'm different. I need some
Mhm.
one-on-one or some support in some way.
Mhm.
So tell me a little bit about functional sobriety program and how people can work with you.
Yeah. So thank you so much, first of all, for having me on the podcast
Yeah, of course.
and digging into this. You're actually my first interview that is specific to the book. So
Oh, yay,
it's a
me.
good to dive into like each of,
Yay.
like I haven't talked about the archetypes or anything
You're
yet. So
doing
it's super
amazing.
cool. Um, yeah, so I created functional sobriety because again, I recognized that there was this huge need to address these different parts of our body, especially in those of us who have a history of drinking. And so, we talked about a couple of those things that we focus on, which are gut health and the gut microbiome, neurotransmitters, vitamin, nutrient deficiencies, hormone, blood sugar balance, etc. And so I have a couple of different online offers. One of them is an online course called the Functional Sobriety Academy, which is really a self-guided course that helps you develop your own nutrition and supplement program using the functional sobriety principles. So it walks you through a lot of the education behind it. So you can really arm and empower yourself with that knowledge, but then really start to understand more about your body, more about what supplements you need. And I created this because I do see one-on-one clients, but not very many of them, because I want to help everyone.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so I
yeah.
tried to create this in a way that I could work with more people, and
More
allow them to do it on
scalable.
their own time. Yeah. And along with that, I also have an online group. It's called the Functional Sobriety Network. And anyone who joins the academy gets access to the network. And that's really where we have a lot of the rich
Awesome.
discussion. So we have weekly meetings. There are challenges each month. We have daily content that is posted. There's a private podcast in there. So a lot of great information there. And it's really designed to support and be this well-rounded approach where if you're listening and you're interested in getting sober, or you're already sober and you want to learn how to heal your body more, this is the place to do it. And it's the place that's going to arm you with all that information to be good, to feel good, and to kind of keep and sustain that sobriety.
I love that. I love all the parts about that. I feel like it's so helpful.
Yeah.
I was all private podcast. That's a great idea. Are you interviewing people that are like in your group and stuff too?
Not yet. No, the private podcast is one of the newer features. So it's just
I
me,
love
but
that.
going into exactly like we talked about with these topics, it's a lot easier to explain them with voice rather than typing and writing, which I learned in this.
Oh my
That
God.
some of them are easier to describe or explain vocally. And so
Yeah.
it's really diving into more of these topics in depth, and giving people more access, because some people want to listen, some people want to read,
Yeah.
and a lot of people who are in these groups and are, I think, sober and sober curious, have benefited from podcasts like this one,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
being able to listen on their way to work, or when they need a little bit of a pick me up. So it's great to
Yeah.
have the audio option too.
Yeah, no, I love the group aspect too, because you're not available 24/7. So people need a support group. They need a support system. They need somewhere to go to, like, life gets lifey and the shit hits the fan, and we need to be able to talk about stuff at, like, in the moment as we're going through it. So I think it's so important to have like
Yeah.
a group and everybody is kind of on the same page. Everyone kind of gets it. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot
when
of us
we're,
don't have, when we're first getting sober, we don't really maybe know a lot of people who are sober, who don't drink,
yeah,
or, we
yeah.
need that additional support system of people that understands.
Yes, connection
Yeah.
is key to that. Well, Brooke, you were doing an amazing job. I really love the book. I love this. It's so, like, backed by science. It's so well written. And I'm really thinking that the functional sobriety program is going to be super helpful for those who really don't identify with some of the more traditional ways. There's a lot of language in that. There's a lot about it that's tricky, I would say. I love all the things. Like, I'm one of those recovery. I don't want to say slut, but I like all of it. I love all that. Like, anyway, somebody wants to get sober, I'm all about it. I love all the tools. I've never used just one thing
Mhm.
anyway. So I love this approach that you're taking,
Thank
using
you.
nutrition to really address and that's not to say that your book we didn't get to it, but you had like visualization exercises in the book. So it really does cover, there is a heavy emphasis on body, mind, but there's some spirit in there too, without getting too
Definitely.
far out there.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I think you're
Thank you
doing
so
great
much,
work.
Arlena.
We'll talk
Thank you.
again
Thanks for
soon.
having me.
Of
Yes. Have a great
course.
day.
You too.